Hello, hello. Welcome to the new version of Joe and Cat Chats.
Absolutely.
We're here and we're ready. We're changing platforms because we had to.
Yes. The powers that be wouldn't allow us to do what we wanted to do, so we had to take it somewhere else. We decided to take our ball and go to another park and play.
Yeah, exactly. But you know what? We're still doing it. We're still having these conversations because they're important, and
Absolutely.
It seems like there's people that follow and want to see it. So we're happy to do it.
Exactly. There's an old R&B group from the 70s out of Philadelphia called the OJs. And the OJs had a song called Give the People What They Want. And the hook in the song says, got to give the people what they want. So that's what we are doing. We are giving the people what they want today with episode 12 of Joe and Cat Chats.
Yeah, I can't believe it. It's episode 12 already.
Episode 12 already. 3 months goes by fast, especially when time goes slow.
Yeah, truly. Yeah. So let's get into it. I wanted to ask you, Joe, you went to a very special place yesterday.
Yes, ma'am.
Fort Monroe,
Right.
and you visited a place called Point Comfort.
Correct. Yes, yesterday.
How was that?
It was intriguing. It was interesting. It was somewhat surreal because for those that don't know, the first Africans that were stolen, I won't even say brought over, they were stolen from an area in southwestern Africa, which is now present-day Angola, and brought to British North America, which ultimately became Virginia, which ultimately became part of the United States by July 4th, 1776. There were 20, and the plaque said 20 or odd Negroes, so about 20 or so Black people, Africans, that were part of a Portuguese ship that was captured by 2 British ships. The 2 British ships took the African people off of the Portuguese ship and put them on the British ship, and these 2 British ships were bound for Mexico. These 2 British ships did not have Google Maps or Garmin or a TomTom back in 1619 to guide them. So they made a wrong turn, and they ended up at this place, which is now in present-day Virginia, called Point Comfort. And this is the first instance of Africans being forced into slavery and indentured servitude. And that happened on or about August 20th, 1619. And August 20th, 1619 was quite honestly the beginning of, I don't want to say necessarily the beginning of racism or white supremacy, because that's happened maybe 150 years before with Christopher Columbus and the genocide that was committed against Native Americans. But in terms of African people, Black people, and having to deal with white people in North America, that was the beginning of white supremacy against Black people in North America, which ultimately became the United States. So much of the way of the reasons, the way the United States is the way it is now is because of what happened on that specific date and that specific place on August 20th, 1619. So I went there yesterday, and I was somewhat underwhelmed. And I'm saying that because as far as I'm concerned, August 20th should be as important of a date on the United States calendar as July 4th, December 7th, April 4th, which is the date that Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated. Should be as important as December 7th, D-Day. Should be as important as September 11, 2001. August 20th should be as important as those previous dates that I just mentioned. Yeah. And for many people that were around, it just seemed as if it was just another random day in August, 28, 29 degree weather outside, just another summer day. Hey, let's go to the beach. Let's go kite surfing. Let's go fishing. Let's go crabbing. And I just felt like the proper amount of reverence and reflection for what happened there and how it shaped the course and scope and history of the United States was not there. Just wasn't there. And I was disappointed by that.
That's
I was
disheartening.
there. was disheartening. I was there, and I did an Instagram live video just talking about the history and what that date was and how significant it is to not only Black people, and another date that's important for Black people and for the United States is June 19th, Juneteenth. That's another important date. But it just seemed like it was just like August 20th, whatever. No, it's not August 20th, whatever, because the reason why the United States is what way it is because of that date. And if white people had treated those 20 or so Africans with the same respect as the other white people that were on those two British boats, there wouldn't have been slavery in the United States. There wouldn't have been a need for a 13th Amendment. Yeah. There wouldn't have been a need for a 14th and a 15th Amendment. There wouldn't have been a need for Reconstruction. There wouldn't have been Jim Crow laws. There wouldn't have been a need for a civil rights movement. There wouldn't have been a need, quite honestly, for civil rights heroes. Because if everybody was treated equally, there wouldn't be a representative from that disenfranchised movement that would be willing to risk his or her life to speak truth to power, for fight for the rights that they should deserve and that they should have simply for being human beings in the United States and citizens of the United States. It was, you know, I did that video and I just kind of watched the side and just watched everything that was kind of happening around me, and then, you know, saw a lot of the old buildings that were nearby the fort. And quite honestly, a whole lot of Black people built that fort, Fort Monroe. A whole lot of Black people built a lot of the forts in the United States. I live in Baltimore. There's a major fort in Baltimore called Fort McHenry. Mm-hmm. A lot of Black people built that. A lot of Black people built a lot of the major colleges and universities, these legacy universities like a Harvard, Georgetown, University of Virginia, University of South Carolina, University of North Carolina, which is a 20-minute drive down the road from where I am right now. Black people built this country, and it started on that particular date, August 20th, 1619. And to this day, Black people still have not been paid for the work that we were forced into. And this is our next conversation topic, Catherine, is going to be reparations. We're going to talk about reparations next week, and we're going to talk about the case for American descendants of enslaved people, for reparations. We're going to talk about other disenfranchised people who received reparations from the countries that committed human rights violations against them. We're going to talk about those other countries that have received reparations, other people that have received reparations. And we're going to talk about other colonized nations who are going back to their colonizing countries and asking for reparations, not just asking, demanding reparations. There is a movement in several African countries right now. The Democratic Republic of Congo and the Congo were former colonies of Belgium, and they're asking Belgium for lots of money, lots of it. Yeah. There's the farmland situation that's taking place in South Africa is another issue that it's happening. There's other Francophone speaking countries in Africa that are going back to France and saying, hey, look, we want our money. We want our money. And on the flip side of that, there's, with regards to money and income and wealth, there's another movement that's taking place in France right now called the Gilet Noir movement. Mm-hmm. And there's a movement for migrant workers, mostly from Africa, that are trying to get legal paperwork to stay in France, to ultimately get citizenship and rights to buy a house or rent an apartment and healthcare. And many French corporations are exploiting these African people, mostly Black Africans. And it goes back again to that legacy of colonization, where white people have been exploiting people of color for centuries now. And then we tie that into what happened in the United States starting on August 20th, 1619. And we eventually begin to realize that the racism struggle, it's more than just racism. It is also a class issue. Because in Virginia, after August 20th, 1619, Black people were not the major labor force in Virginia. They weren't the majority of workers that were picking cotton and picking tobacco. It was mostly indentured servants, and most of those indentured servants were poor white people. Mm-hmm. Eventually, the population from Virginia became about 500,000 people, and about 270,000 of that 500,000 people in Virginia were slaves. So think about that. You have a population of 500,000 people, and more than half of the population are Africans working in fields or working in houses.
It's difficult to even imagine that right now.
Yep. Yeah. It's difficult to imagine. And I noticed that video that I did yesterday got a lot of views on it. And then there was a picture that I took a few days ago at a mural in Patterson Park, where the picture said, "It's not Black versus white, it's racists versus everyone." And I think everything that we've been talking about for the past few minutes kind of illustrates that point. Sure, yes, it was obviously white people exploiting people of color for their labor and not paying them for it. Yes. But within that, there were also plenty of white people, rich white people, that were exploiting poor white people and forcing them into a life of indentured servitude. There is that. So in addition to the Black and white issue, it's a class issue. And we're seeing that class issue on full display now. Take a look at this pandemic and how so many of these oligarchs that have made billions and billions of dollars since this pandemic has taken place, they're not only oligarchs, but they're technocrats. And they're all white guys, all of them. And the class divide continues to grow. And it's this sort of hyper-capitalism that is ruining society. And this hyper-capitalism has created this wide chasm between those who have and those who have not. Mm-hmm. Karl Marx talked about this in the Communist Manifesto, where he talks about the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, and the influence and wealth and the power of the bourgeoisie continues to grow, and the proletariat, we're left with literal breadcrumbs, and we're fighting over breadcrumbs at this point. And something needs to change. Something has to change. So this is why we're seeing in the streets of Portland, Oregon, we're seeing protesters, Black Lives Matter protesters, protecting themselves with leaf blowers and beach umbrellas, and walking around with gallons of milk to protect themselves from tear gassing. This is why we're seeing protests in Los Angeles on a day-to-day basis. This is why we're seeing protests continuing in Minneapolis. This is why we are seeing protests continuing in Chicago, Illinois. And this is also why we're going to talk about what we're talking about now, because these protests are not just a domestic issue in the United States and in several cities in your wonderful country of Canada. It's not just happening in Toronto. It's not just happening in Vancouver, a city that I hold dear to my heart. It's not just happening in Calgary, Alberta, a city I'm sure you hold dear to your heart. It's not happening in just Winnipeg or Fernie, British Columbia, or Medicine Hat, or Banff, or Thunder Bay, or Prince Edward Island, or Sydney, Nova Scotia. It's happening all around the world. Yeah. And that's the topic of conversation today. We're going to talk about some of these other hot button issues where there is a struggle for workers, for the average day working human being, the struggle and the fight for humanity, freedom, survival, equality. all of that. There's plenty of examples of that outside of Canada and the United States. And we're going to spend about the next 45 minutes or so discussing these.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. Thank you for saying all of that. I love how you demonstrated so clearly how colonialism and white supremacy is so blatantly pervasive in our society that it's like, it's hard for a lot of people to even imagine a world without it. But it started somewhere, and in the continental US, it started on August 20th, 401 years ago. And so I appreciate that you took the time to honor that and that location, because a lot of us can't travel right now, and it's I think it's really important. So I encourage everybody watching to also check out the IG Live that Joe posted yesterday about it. There's a lot of really good information. So
yeah, there's a lot there, and after you watch that 30-minute IG Live, go ahead and do some research. Go ahead and do your own research, because I can only provide so much information, but there's a whole lot of people out who have done a whole lot more research than me that are they're more qualified to talk on a lot more of these issues, because they spent the majority of their professional lives studying these particular topics. But there's stuff out there to be learned. They can follow your Instagram feed, look at your story. There's plenty of information there on a variety of topics. And there's plenty of books to be read about anti-racism, racism, wealth inequality, medical apartheid, etc. And many of those books that I talked about this in reference to those topics, you could take a look at my Instagram highlights. There's an Instagram highlight titled BHM 2020. This is in honor of Black History Month, which is in February. And I decided to do a book or a journal every day of the month, which was 29 days this year because it was the leap year, discussing why the United States is the way it is. And there's a pile of these books all over the place. When affirmative action was white, the color of law, Black banking and the racial wealth gap, Black labor, white wealth, policing while Black, race matters. There's the 1619 Project. There's the Racial Wealth Gap Report by Dr. Sandy Darity and Derek Hamilton and Antonio Moore. There's From Here to Equality by Dr. Sandy Darity, that book about the case for reparations. Yeah. So there's a lot of information there. So if you want to continue to educate yourself, in addition to the type of socio-political and socioeconomic education that you and I provide, please go for it. We're here for you.
Yeah, I appreciate that as well, because I also always encourage people to do their own research. I mean, we just have a little bit of time to like provide a little piece of information that I really hope people take and roll with and learn more about, which is something I will also encourage for today's chat about global issues and international uprisings, because I do think that it is our responsibility to remain aware and vigilant about what's happening around us, around the world. We live in a globalized world, like point blank.
We do.
So I also just wanted to sort of mention that as I prepared for this week's chat, I was just looking at sort of news sources and human rights organizations, and really we're just providing like a super brief outline of the issues. And so please do go and do your research, because these aren't firsthand accounts of what's happening. And so I know that we can't speak for anyone else, in the countries that we're going to talk about. So I just wanted to make sure I mentioned that.
Yeah, and there's a lot of countries that are dealing with, to a certain extent, actually not even to a certain extent, many of the problems that we're seeing now in Canada and the United States that have its historical roots in white supremacy and government corruption. We're seeing a common theme in many of these countries now, and we're going to start talking about some of them, because it's important that we pay attention to our brothers and sisters in other countries and other continents around the world.
Yeah, I totally agree. So,
all right.
In your words, why don't we get our passports ready and get going?
Got the passports ready. We've already gone through airport security. We're in the Air Canada Lounge in Pearson Airport in Toronto. We're getting ready to fly. As well as where are we off to?
Let's go to Asia first this time.
Asia. Whoa. Yeah. Okay. Where in Asia are we going?
Let's head up a small country. Let's go to Thailand.
Thailand. Okay. What exactly is happening in Thailand right now?
Thailand has some protests happening as we speak against government and the power of the monarchy, because this primarily student-led protests, they're fed up with the power of the monarchy, the silencing laws that the monarchy has imposed upon them, and they want constitutional rights because they deserve it, clearly.
Absolutely.
And the government has been restricting internet access. There's been reports of awful police brutality with the protesters, among other things. So, yeah.
And what's interesting about the situation in Thailand, and I was just in Thailand about 5 months ago. In fact, it was February. It was February 29th. I was there. So it was the last day of Black History Month of all days. Yeah. And I was in Thailand and I spent a couple of days there. And I've been to Thailand 4 or 5 times. And this year I noticed that the energy was different in the city. And what I mean by that, it wasn't as vibrant. It wasn't as convivial. It wasn't as welcoming. There seemed to be this creeping sense of dread and despair that was in the country, even though the weather was great. Walking around the JJ Market was awesome. Drinking water out of the coconut was awesome. The coconut ice cream out of the little coconut shells was wonderful. And the pad thai on the street was excellent. But it just didn't feel the same. And I think a lot of it had to do with that potential, that undercurrent, that underbelly of an uprising that was slowly taking place there. And one of the words that we keep using in many of our conversations is intersectionality. We keep using that term over and over and over again. And similarly to what's happened in Thailand, it's a similar situation that's taking place right now in Hong Kong. And seeing how we're keeping it in Asia. And Hong Kong to Asia, not a far, it's about a 2.5 hour flight. You can fly out of the big airport or the other airport in Bangkok. 2.5 hours, easy flight, get into Hong Kong, take the Hong Kong Express train to the center of the city. And in Hong Kong, it's a similar situation. You have college students, young people who are fighting for their freedom, fighting for their human rights, and to ensure that they won't be taken over by Chinese rule. They're also fighting against certain extradition laws to make sure that if a Hong Konger commits a crime in Hong Kong, they will not be extradited to China for their punishment.
Yeah, that's a big one.
It's a huge thing.
Yeah, I mean, they're trying to keep their democracy, which is not something that China has. So,
correct.
Yeah, that's a really important one. And I think something that's noteworthy, many people might remember the protests in Hong Kong have been happening for a long while, over a year.
At least a year.
And the masks, the medical sort of, not the medical, the like blue sort of ones you see in a hospital, those ones were sort of an iconic symbol of the protests there.
Absolutely.
And they eventually got banned last fall. And so I think it's worth noting that, you know, this is just an interesting time to be having that, because it was only a few months before COVID happened, and now all of us are wearing masks out in public places. And, you know, I wish I could, you know, say that a lot of it was in solidarity of the Hong Kong protesters, but clearly, I mean, COVID has changed that. But
it has.
Yeah, I think there's some interesting implications to be considered, I guess.
It has. And as for full disclosure, I've been to Hong Kong every January or February for the past 5 years now, including this year. I was also in Hong Kong. In fact, I was in Hong Kong 3 or 4 days before I went to Thailand this year. And after I got off the airplane and took the cab to Central Station, and then got on the ferry to Llama Island, I didn't leave Llama Island until I was supposed to play my show, which was not even in kind of the center area of Hong Kong, but kind of a bit further out. And even being around Central Station and the big hotel and the mall and all the shops there, you can feel that the vibe was different there too. And I saw a lot of boarded up storefronts and buildings as a result of the civil unrest that had been taking place there over the past year, but really has ramped up within the past 6 months. I was in Hong Kong in January of last year, and there were people wearing medical masks back then, but it had nothing to do with COVID-19. Mm-hmm. It was to protect themselves from all these other different strains of flu. COVID-19, the coronavirus, wasn't on anybody's mind in January of 2019. Mm-hmm. And I remember being in China then, and in China back in 2018, and Hong Kong back in 2018. And I remember vividly walking around the streets of Beijing and Shanghai and Kunming, China, and Chengdu, China, and seeing people wearing masks. That's just because the air pollution of those countries is terrible. Mm-hmm. And now we fast forward 18 to 24 months later in some cases, and we're seeing people in Hong Kong wearing masks, not only because of COVID-19, but because as a form of solidarity against potential Chinese reoccupation.
Mm-hmm. And something to note as well, to sort of further the point, is just that the symbolism of wearing a mask came about also in addition to all of the things you just mentioned. Yes. As a way to not allow the horrendous police and military to be able to identify people.
Correct.
So that's why they banned it, because China is very much into surveillance. So yeah, that's a political implication of this too. And so it's interesting how it's playing out with how, the pandemic has impacted all of us, and our perceptions of these masks have been shifted because of that.
Absolutely. So. And you mentioned China, and the surveillance state, and traveling from Hong Kong to China, it's not far. I mean, if you wanted to travel from Hong Kong to Shenzhen, you could do that, including the border crossing, in about 45 minutes. Get on the bus, go to security, they look at your passport, look at you, and you're in China. And I think one of the major situations that is going relatively undiscussed in global news right now is the situation taking place with China and the Uyghur people in China. The Uyghurs are a group of Muslim Chinese, and a genocide is taking place against them. Genocide. And there are millions, or maybe not millions, but hundreds of thousands of Uyghurs who are just gone missing. We don't know where they are or what has happened to them. And it's giving China's surveillance state and state-controlled media and many of the forms of social media that you and I use are completely firewalled in China. There's no Instagram in China. There's no Google in China. There's no Facebook or Yahoo in China. Mm-hmm. None of that exists in China. So there's no Twitter in China. It's completely controlled, state-controlled. And to give you an idea of how controlled the locus of control that China has on its people, in addition to cameras being everywhere and controlled social media, using paper money and coins is somewhat difficult to go by in China, because they've gotten to a point now where, for example, if you want to go to a bar and buy a drink, using cash is almost unheard of. You're paying with your cell phone.
Yeah.
And there are there's two major payment gateways that typically that you see in China. There's Alipay and there's WeChat Pay. And WeChat Pay is through the WeChat app. And there's a QR code. You have a list of drinks, there's a QR code. And whatever drink you want, you scan with your phone based upon the payment gateway app that you have on your phone, whether it's Alipay or WeChat Pay. You scan it, you hear the beep, you get your drink. China is not completely cashless, but it's going that way. And I have a 9-year-old daughter. By the time my daughter turns 21, I could see China going completely cashless. Mm-hmm. And that is another potential way to control society. Because if you can control people's money electronically, you have an easier opportunity to control them socially. Mm-hmm. I vividly remember, not this past year, but last year, walking around Tiananmen Square. Walking around there. And I know what happened in Tiananmen Square with the protests and the man standing in front of the tank. And I was talking with some friends of mine there who were showing me around. And I asked them about that particular situation. They said, no, they didn't know anything about it. They didn't know anything about it. The reason why is because the Chinese media had censored it. Mm-hmm. It censored it completely. And I remember walking around Tiananmen Square and just thinking, wow, this might be the most secure place on earth. There were all sorts of Chinese soldiers wearing these hunter green uniforms walking around. Every single entry and entrance it was like going through an airport. It was airport level security, bag checks, body scans, metal detectors. And it's that sort of level of control that Chinese government has over its people, and the ability to not report the news, but to tell your story and to hide whatever story you want, especially the situation taking place with the Uyghur people in China. It's a big problem. And it's this sort of Islamophobia that is also happening in Myanmar, or a country otherwise known as Burma, with the Rohingya. The Rohingya are a group of people in Myanmar who are Muslim, and they're being persecuted against. Mm-hmm. And the Burmese government does not want to recognize them as Burmese citizens. And the largest refugee crisis one of the largest refugee crises taking place right now is in Myanmar with the Rohingya. Many of them are not getting citizenship rights to become even Burmese citizens. The Burmese government has rendered them stateless. And if you are stateless, it's virtually impossible to get any sort of citizenship from another country or to another country. So some of the Rohingya will try to travel to Bangladesh, for example, and will get turned away at the border because they're stateless. Yeah. And it's a horrific situation, again, with the Rohingya in Myanmar. They're suffering through famine, genocide. The Burmese army is killing the Rohingya at unprecedented rates, and it's this sort of, again, Islamophobia that's taking place that we're seeing it more and more in Asia.
Yeah. I mean, there's been, a restriction to rights and freedoms of expression, association, Absolutely. And peaceful assembly, both with the Rohingya in Burma and also the Uyghurs in China.
Yes.
Authorities in China have even imposed intrusive surveillance, arbitrary detention, and forced indoctrination, which means they're kidnapping people and putting them into camps and indoctrinating them into, letting go of, they're trying to get rid of their culture and their belief systems, which is something that we have talked about before. It happened in Canada, and it's called the residential schools. And if you don't know what that is, please look it up. Mm-hmm. It's horrendous. And back to Burma. Okay. Many of the folks the Rohingya folks that have been refugees have gone to Malaysia, and they are not seeing refuge, because Malaysia government has used the COVID-19 pandemic as a scapegoat to justify violently raiding the refugee camps and deporting many back to Burma.
Right.
They perpetuate the xenophobic views, the Islamophobic views, and so these people are just being brutalized. And there's basically a genocide happening that no one's talking about, with apartheid rules and statelessness, like you mentioned. It's it's just heartbreaking to realize that this is happening right now. It's like we haven't learned from our historical travesties.
We haven't. And what the Malaysian government is doing right now in terms of taking in refugees and then sending them back to their home countries, to their homeland, that is a human rights violation.
Yeah.
The specific term for illegally sending a refugee or an asylum seeker back to their homeland, it's called refoulement. It's spelled REFOULEMENT. And that is illegal. If somebody comes to your country based on the United Nations definition of a refugee, if they come to your country because of a well-founded fear of persecution based upon religion, gender, political affiliation, sexual orientation, there's a couple of other criteria, but there has to be a well-founded fear of persecution. And if you come to that other country because you will die if you stay where you are, and if that country that you go to sends you back there, that is a human rights violation. That is wrong. And to that extent, to a similar extent, Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has done a similar. He's actually doing this now, because there are loads of Ethiopian Jews and Eritrean Jews and Somalian Jews that go to Israel, and it is, from my understanding, within a Jewish person's birthright to go to Israel. What's happening now is that Benjamin Netanyahu is performing essentially an ethnic cleansing of Black Jews in Israel. So he has offered many Black Jews money to leave Israel, and to go back to the countries from whence they came. So that is illegal. You can't do that. That, again, that's refoulement. That's against it's against the United Nations Conventions for Refugees. It's against international law to do that. Speaking of Israel and human rights violations, for the past 8 days, Israel has been bombing Gaza, and we've not seen a word anywhere about this, anywhere, unless you look on Twitter, unless you look there, and if you're lucky to find out about it. We also know about...
I barely got notification of it. And I'm somebody that tries to pay attention. So this is it's a censorship.
Censorship. We also know about Israel's continued occupation of Palestine and everything that is happening there. We know about the Israeli army and the cutting off power to certain parts of Palestine, cutting off food supplies to Palestine, cutting off water to certain parts of Palestine, the continued bombing of Gaza, the continued conflict in the West Bank. So again, it's important that we pay attention to what's happening there in Palestine, because that is a genocide taking place there too.
Also, as we speak, I think we could speak about the Israeli-Palestinian issues for a whole episode. But I think I think just briefly, I wanted to mention that like Israel's occupation of Palestine has been since the 50s, and it's
Absolutely.
institutionalized genocide of Palestinian people through
Yes.
apartheid.
Yes.
And like the Israeli government is very powerful and very rich because they're funded by Western
Yes.
countries like
Mostly
the
the United
US
States.
and Canada.
Yes.
Palestine is not. Israeli government blocks the internet in the West Bank consistently, like you mentioned with the power outs as well.
Mm-hmm.
Women and LGBTQ folks face ongoing violence and discrimination on both sides. Mm-hmm. Israelis detain Palestinians and systematically destroy homes to annex the land. And they also recently legally annexed an important geographical location, a piece of land that basically landlocks many Palestinians on the east side of the country. So yeah, it's a systematic genocide.
Yes.
Yeah.
It is. And additionally, there's been numerous reports of the Israeli army shooting doctors who try to help Palestinians. There's also been stories of Israeli armed forces shooting reporters who try to report in the field about the conflict between Israel and Palestine. Now, if we contrast, there's an obvious comparison between the Israeli military shooting reporters and what's happening in the United States right now, with the United States military shooting reporters who are reporting about Black Lives Matter protests. So again, part of the reason why we're doing this particular episode is to highlight that, what's happening in the United States and Canada is not exclusive to the United States and Canada. It's happening in other countries. In fact, it might have happened in those other countries first, and then the United States and Canada said, hey, you know what? That's a really good idea. Let's try that here. And in reverse, we've seen plenty of times where the United States has gone ahead and used military forces to quell protests. Mm-hmm. We're seeing that right now. We're going to go a little far north in Europe. We're going to go to Belarus now because we're seeing that situation take place with the Belarusian president, Alexander Lukashenko.
Yeah.
And his use of the Belarusian military against the citizens. And I'm having a terrible time pronouncing the lady's name. I don't know if you have the lady's name.
Oh, yeah, Svetlana Tikhanovskaya. I think.
Yes.
Something like that.
Yes. She's a 37-year-old translator and interpreter by trade. She's a mother of two, and she is now the new face of the Belarusian people because her husband is a noted YouTuber and social activist and an outspoken critic against Lukashenko's government. Mm-hmm. And Lukashenko has been the only president of Belarus since Belarus became an independent country 27 or 28 years ago, when the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, otherwise known as USSR, was one big country and it broke up into 15 countries. Leadership in many of those other countries has changed hands over and over and over again, but the leadership of Belarus does not. Lukashenko is widely regarded in Europe as Europe's last dictator because, in fact, that is what he is. He's held power there ever since the USSR broke up into 15 independent countries. And there's been widespread allegations and conversations about election fraud, voter fraud. Mm-hmm. The economy is in the tank and sinking.
Yeah.
The COVID-19 pandemic is running rampant. Joblessness and unemployment is out of control. And Svetlana's husband was like, look, we are tired of this. We want something new. So the Belarusian government arrested him, and he's still in jail right now. So his wife, Svetlana, took over and led this populist movement. And she wants to become president of Belarus. Mm-hmm. And Lukashenko was like, no, that's not happening. And there have been plenty of threats, death threats on her life, against her 2 children, against other family members. So she recently left the country for Lithuania for her own safety. For her own safety. The protests in Belarus are continuing now to this day. They're not letting up. They're continuing to pressure the Belarusian government. And Vladimir Putin in Russia has agreed to offer military help to make sure that the Belarusian people, according to numerous reports, quote unquote, stay in line.
Yeah, I mean, that's an issue in and of itself. And I encourage anyone who wants to look into this issue to actually look into some of the videos that are available about with the Belarus protests, because they are massive and striking to see on a screen. So yeah, I mean, the police brutality, the military has been used against the protesters. The brutality is just an ongoing theme in these places that we as activists have to just deal with and be peaceful about, in whatever sense that means.
Absolutely.
Reporters, protesters have reported widespread torture too, which is also very illegal.
In all forms. In all forms. Something else. We're going to stay in Europe, and I would be remiss. I think we would be remiss if we did not mention France and what has been taking place in France for the better part of over a year now. Now, I'm sure you'll probably notice that at many of the protests that I've attended, and for the better part of a little more than a year now, on Fridays, I haven't been doing it for the past couple of Fridays, but in a lot of videos that you've seen me in recently, I've been wearing a yellow vest. And I've been wearing that yellow vest in solidarity with the Gilet Jaune for a little more than a year now. And when I was in Paris last year, I was there the weekend that the Cathedral of Notre Dame burned down. I was there that week. Yeah. In fact, I was happened to be hanging out with a couple of friends of mine, like there, right near at the Pont Marie, which is the Marie Bridge, which is one or two bridges, I think, south of the Cathedral of Notre Dame. And I opened up, turned on the phone, started filming. There's 300,000 views of that video on my Facebook page. Started filming. Yeah. And I remember I flew into France, Paris, into Charles de Gaulle Airport on a Saturday. And I remember seeing some Gilet Jaune protesters nearby, not necessarily near where I was staying, but walking around parts of the streets. And some of the people I was hanging out with that weekend, they knew people who were involved in the protest movement. And I was like, whoa, what's this about? And they were telling me about it. And I was like, well, look, how can I help? And they were like, look, just show awareness. So I said, okay, look, every time I do a show on a Saturday, I'll wear a yellow vest. So you could go through my Instagram feed and you'll see a whole lot of pictures and videos of me wearing a yellow vest. And the Gilet Jaune movement is an important movement. It's an important group of protests because it was about workers trying to not be screwed over by the neoliberal centrist-led government of Emmanuel Macron. Mm-hmm. Emmanuel Macron has never held a political office in his life. Before he became the leader of France, he was France's finance minister. And if you understand anything about the French election that took place, I want to say in 2017, there are some obvious parallels between the 2017 French election and the United States 2016 election. Okay? Walk with me for a second. Now, in the United States election, you had a far left candidate, Bernie Sanders. You had a centrist candidate that was really running as a Democrat, Hillary Clinton. And you had a far right-wing candidate, Donald Trump. In the French election, you had a left-wing candidate in Mélenchon. You had the somewhat centrist candidate who really catered to the 1% because he was the former finance minister of the country, in Emmanuel Macron. And then you had a far right-wing political candidate, anti-immigration, anti-Islam, anti-LGBTQ, in Marine Le Pen. Okay?
Yeah.
So in both countries, the far left candidate was sort of pushed out of the final running of the election. So Bernie Sanders his movement got co-opted, and Mélenchon, he ended up not getting enough votes. So in the United States, you had Hillary Clinton versus Donald Trump. In France, you had Emmanuel Macron versus Marine Le Pen. The only real difference between the French election and the United States election is that the French elected the centrist. The United States did not. So if you take a look at a lot of what's happened in the United States and how considerably more xenophobic the United States has gotten, or at least blatantly more xenophobic the United States has gotten, because Obama did a whole lot of stuff that was clearly xenophobic, with him deporting loads of people, and the quote-unquote Muslim ban that Donald Trump had, where he banned 7 people for countries with 7 countries. Obama started that, but Trump took it to the next level. Mm-hmm. So if you look at a lot of what's happened, Marine Le Pen would have done everything, quite honestly, that Emmanuel Macron is doing in terms of immigration and workers and screwing over workers. But the rhetoric would have been considerably more vitriolic under Marine Le Pen. Yeah. So this is part of the reason why you had the Gilet Jaune protests, these yellow vest protests. It was also about against Macron increasing a gas tax against the workers, and train workers, railway workers, pensions being taken away and their pay being cut. So people were protesting in the streets about that. Mm-hmm. Every Saturday, you could watch RT and they would stream these protests live. There's a video news network that's connected to RT where they don't do any spoken word reporting. It's all video reporting. The network is called Ruptly, RUPTLY. You could turn on Ruptly and you would just see hours and hours and hours of Gilet Jaune footage. In addition to that, there's another movement that is taking place in France right now called the Gilet Noir movement, Black Vest movement. This is also important, and it's going to dovetail into what we're going to talk, the continent we're going to go to next is Africa. Because as we talked about in the beginning part of this video, that Africa was colonized a lot by France. There's many Francophone speaking countries. Now, many of these countries that were exploited by France, not only economically, but ecologically, in terms of their mineral resources being taken and France profiting from the mineral resources. Many of the people from these countries, like Mali and Burkina Faso and Central African Republic, excuse me, and many of the Northern African countries, Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia. And out to my friends in Tunisia, I got some really good, dear, close friends of mine in Tunisia that I miss dearly, and I can't wait to see them again. There's many of them have come to France to work because many of the jobs in these Francophone speaking countries that were colonies of France has used up the resources. And many of these people have come to France to work. And many French corporations have decided to not give these economic migrants their legal work permits. Mm-hmm. Many of these French corporations have decided to exploit these Africans, most of them Black Africans, most of them being Black Africans who just want to work and live a normal life and send enough money back to their families so their families can have food on the table and a roof to sleep under and a bed to sleep in. So what's happened is many of these French corporations have said, hey, you know what? We're not giving you these papers. And you're going to work for €3 an hour or €5 an hour. And if you don't work for €5 an hour, we will deport your ass back to whatever country you came from. And you won't be allowed back into France ever again. Take your pick. You either shut your mouth and work, or we will deport you. So,
yeah, that's not unlike some programs we have here in Canada.
Yeah. So a group of these migrant workers has decided to protest in solidarity, and there's a Black French female lawmaker. Her name escapes me. I can't remember her name, but she's also helped to organize many of these sit-ins at many large French government buildings to raise awareness for migrant workers who want their rights from the French government. So these people, in addition to supporting the Gilet Jaune movement, the Yellow Vest movement, because it's a workers' populist movement, have also been wearing black vests in support of migrant workers. In the trunk of my car, whenever I go to a protest, I usually wear a yellow vest, but I also have a black vest because it's important to show solidarity with that also. I wish I had my black vest hanging up behind me. It would have been a nice little prop hanging up. It would have been cool, but yeah, I mean, it's because this sort of, again, we talked about this in the beginning part of the video, how bourgeoisie, proletariat, worker, owner.
Yeah.
It's class warfare again. It's exploitation of labor. Yeah. And it's in addition to exploitation of labor, it's exploitation of labor where the exploited people are typically people of color.
Yes.
We're seeing that in France now.
Yeah.
And that's with the black vests. With the Gilet Jaune, with the yellow vests, it's mostly working class white people who are protesting against the government and the 1%. We're seeing that. So again, it's this sort of class struggle between poor white people and the 1%. And we're also seeing a race and class struggle between migrant workers, economic migrants from Africa, darker skinned, black and Northern Saharan Africans from Algeria, Morocco, Western Sahara, Tunisia, Libya, Egypt, etc., who are coming to France to look for work. And they're not only having to face the class struggle of being a poor, someone who is lower on the socioeconomic scale, but also having to deal with having darker skin. And as Dr. Lees pointed out in that one speech, the biological social irrelevance that has fatal social consequences.
Yes. Oh my gosh. Thank you so much for putting all of that out. I have so much to say, but you said most of what I was going to say anyway, so I appreciate that so much.
No problem.
Joe, I think we have so much more to talk about. Do you want to do a part 2 to episode 12 and keep recording?
Yeah,
Let's do it.
This is going to be, because we still have Africa, we still have South
so
America.
much. We haven't even covered half of what I wrote notes on, so I think we should do that.
Yeah. So,
awesome.
All right. So, so we're going to do episode 12 and a half.
Yes.
We're going to be episode 12.5. 12.5.
Heck yes. Yeah. So I'm going to stop recording and then we'll start again.
Perfect. Sounds great.